Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to this session of the In Dialogue Foundation Certificate course in Dialogue Studies for the 2023-24 academic session. Firstly, I'd like to extend my heartfelt wishes for a Happy New Year to each of you. Tonight, we are honored to have with us Professor Ori Soltes, a distinguished scholar and educator. Professor Soltes will enlighten us on a compelling topic: Fethullah Gulen's understanding of dialogue and Hizmet's role in peacebuilding across the globe. Professor Soltes brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to this discussion. He is a respected faculty member at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where he imparts his wisdom in theology, art history, philosophy, and political history. Professor Soltes' academic journey has also embraced a variety of disciplines at esteemed institutions such as the Johns Hopkins University, Cleveland State University, Case Western Reserve University, and Siegel College in Cleveland, among others. Beyond academia, Professor Soltes is renowned for his engaging lectures at prestigious museums across the United States, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the National Gallery of Art, and the Smithsonian Institution, to name just a few. His expertise has been showcased on major networks like CNN, the History Channel, and the Discovery Channel, and he has captivated audiences with a popular series on ancient civilizations for middle school students. Sir, the floor is yours for up to 2 hours. Please feel free to allocate time for questions and discussions as you see fit. Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Ori Soltes. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ali. It's my pleasure to be here, and I reiterate your request that people put themselves on camera. Otherwise, it's like talking to a wall. I realized the first semester of teaching Zoom that I was more tired than usual, and that was the reason, because I did not require my students to show themselves, and it was like talking to a wall, and it's a whole different ballgame. So Fethullah Gulen, his name Fethullah, of course, has embedded within it the word Allah, Arabic for God, as most of you, of course, are aware. And what is most significant about that for today's discussion is that he was born in 1938, but you will find his birth date often given as 1941 mistakenly, and that's because he was born into the Turkey of Ataturk, which was not only secular, there's nothing wrong with that, but which suppressed religious expression, and I think there is something wrong with that. And so his father was not permitted to register his birth because embedded in his name was the word God, and that was considered antithetical to the purposes of the state. So it took 3 years until a more sympathetic clerk who knew his father, who was himself a prominent Islamic scholar, to allow him to register his son. So the very beginning of Fethullah Gulen's life, in retrospect, has an interesting twist to it that is not present for most people's lives. And the secularity of the Turkey in which he grew up is very much a beginning point for what he becomes and how he evolves and what his significance is for all of us and for the world. He was drawn very much to a kind of pious life. His parents were both extremely pious. I mentioned his father, a scholar. His mother was someone who was teaching him Quran when he was 2. He was a hafiz, someone who had memorized the Quran by an early age, 9, 10, 11. I've read different exact days. It doesn't matter. He was young, let's face it. And to know the entire Quran by heart is an impressive feat for anyone at any age. And he felt called in that direction. And even in elementary school, one of his teachers criticized him for being too pious because, again, she felt that it went against the grain of what Turkey was trying to be as a secular state. And I repeat, not just as a secular state, but as a secular state that made a point of suppressing religious expression, because one can separate church from state without disenfranchising or making it difficult for the church to function as such. You simply don't allow it per se to have a voice in the government, lest minority groups feel suppressed by the majority church. And of course, I'm using that word church in a kind of generic way, as we do in English. But there are some states, and Turkey was one of them under Ataturk, which, to repeat, went further than that and really tried to suppress any kind of public expressions of religion. So that, for example, for women, it was considered illegal to be on the street wearing any kind of a headgear, hijab, whatever you want to call it. If you were likely to be apprehended by the police. And similarly, it evolved that because it's connected also to a kind of Westernocentric post-colonial response to the colonialism by becoming colonial culturally yourself. So men were absolutely discouraged from wearing fez, which was a classic and typical headgear in Turkey, and were expected to be wearing the kind of Western hat that was acceptable. So it was an interesting kind of world. And I'm making a point about this because as he grew up and ultimately moved in the direction of becoming an imam, which is what he achieved, and it's a paradox that Turkey did permit people to become imams, but you had to study in a state school and you had to abide by certain rules that were governed by the state. And he ended up, through a number of different postings, ultimately in Izmir on the western coast, a very large modern city. I think it's the second largest city in Turkey after Istanbul. I think Ankara is probably the third. And one of the things he realized, well, two things he realized. One was that the audience for his Friday sermons in the mosque were essentially old people. There were no young people. And he also had come to sense for Turkey that its young people were very much adrift. This is the late 60s. This is the early 70s. This was a time period when really across the Western world in particular, there was a lot of unrest because of a lot of dissatisfaction on the part of young people. That's the time when I was coming of age. That's the time when I was in high school and university. With the way Western governments, cultures, societies were conducting themselves. I mean, there were particular directions in the United States, for example, our involvement in Southeast Asia, the so-called Vietnam War was a particular focus, but it went more broadly than that with respect to issues of race and gender and so on. So he felt of Turkish youth that it was kind of adrift. And he felt that a large part of the reason was that it had been cut off from its Muslim roots. That Turkey, with a long history through the Ottoman period of having an Islamic personality, had lost that personality perforce. When Ataturk created the modern state in 1922, he engaged in a number of reforms. For our purposes, the most important one being, again, the not only discouragement of, but the suppression of religious expression. So he felt that youth, the Turkish youth was cut off, was deracinated from its own roots, and therefore kind of adrift. And he realized there was no way that he would make contact with youth by way of simply being an imam in a masjid and offering prayers and offering a sermon on Friday afternoon prayers. So he started to go into coffee shops. And I should add another detail about him, and that is, in the formal sense, he never went beyond elementary school for his education. But in fact, his voracious hunger and thirst for all kinds of knowledge and wisdom, and those are two different things, you understand, knowledge and wisdom, but for all kinds of knowledge and wisdom, and his extraordinary memory, after all, to repeat, he was someone who had memorized the entire Quran at an early age, led him to self-educate in all kinds of directions. So it's not just that by way of studying to become an imam, he became so conversant with things that you would expect an imam to know about, the Quran, the Hadith, the different madhabs of Sharia, the lives of the prophets, that sort of literature. But he was interested in, and he read Socrates. He was interested, and he read Einstein. He was interested in everything from philosophy to physics, and his prodigious mind worked in two ways to make him a very effective autodidact. One way to repeat is his prodigious memory. But you can memorize stuff and not really know what it's about. There are plenty of hafizes who know the entire Quran, but you say, well, what does this particular ayat, what does this particular verse actually mean? And it's like, it just says such and such, you know? But he, secondly, had a wonderful analytic capacity. So he not only knew so many different was learning and still knows so many different things in so many different directions, but has an extremely insightful understanding of whether it is Quran or whether it is Hadith or whether it is physics that made him particularly effective as a young man who would engage in conversations in coffee houses with young people. He'd make a little speech or he'd get into a conversation and there are a few people gathering around, then there are a few people, more people gathering around, and he would entertain whatever questions people had. And although I wasn't there, I suspect that there must have been times where he did not know the answer to a question because no one knows everything. And I suspect what he said was, I'm not sure about that. Come back tomorrow. I'll have some sort of an answer, which also meant that he was encouraging people to keep returning. And he became so well known and popular locally that people started recording the things that he said. And so these tapes were starting to proliferate and spread all over Turkey, so that he became arguably the best known imam across the country, but also known for his unique style. It's not just his charisma, it's not just his eloquence, but the fact that he was so extraordinarily capable of drawing from so many different fields in the discussions that he led and applying them to the Islamic state of being as he was exploring it, and interweaving what one finds from Quran to the latest discussion by the latest imams to the larger world and vice versa. So he became very well known. But at a certain point, and I would say that turning point came somewhere in the 80s, he began to realize something. It's not just about Turkey. It's not just about Muslims. It's not just about Sunni Muslims. It's not just about Alevi Muslims. It's got to be about all of us. Otherwise, in the end, none of us gets where we want to get. So he became increasingly vehement as a protagonist for conversation, for dialogue, not only within Islam, among its myriad factions, but between Islam and other forms of faith. Be those forms of faith Abrahamic, Judaism, Christianity, be they Dharmic, Hinduism, Buddhism, be they beyond either of those kinds of categories, people who are by faith Shintos or by faith Confucian, and so on. He had a much, much wider vision of the need for all of us ultimately to be engaged in dialogue with each other. So he began to promote, he began increasingly to preach and teach about dialogue, multicultural dialogue, interfaith dialogue, international dialogue. And dialogue, on the one hand, has a history that, if one thinks of Western tradition at least, begins with Socrates and Plato and the ancient Greeks, because it was Socrates' conviction that one learns best about anything one is trying to understand when one is in conversation with someone else. Because Socrates reasoned, and in the Platonic dialogues that present Socrates in discussion with others, demonstrated repeatedly that if I'm only thinking about things on my own, talking to myself, so to speak, There's no one to catch the errors that might occur in my thinking for any number of reasons. I mean, they could be factual errors, but they could be thinking errors because I'm just too stuck in myself and don't see the holes in my thought that someone else might see. So if you and I engage in a dialogue, you may see flaws in my thinking that I won't notice, and I may see flaws in your thinking that you might notice. Well, for Socrates, who lived in a world where everybody believed in multiple gods and goddesses, the issues that Socrates was trying to get at, because he introduced ethics into Greek thought, was, what is justice? What is holiness? What is piety? What is friendship? What is self-control? What is the good? And all of those come, so to say, in the Socratic context without a particularized religious connotation, because they all believe in many, many different gods and goddesses, and they understand that the gods and goddesses disagree with each other because their own literature teaches them that. So in fact, when one of his interlocutors, a guy by the name of Euthyphro, who proclaims to be a sophos, a wise man, a sophist, is queried by Socrates as to what constitutes holiness or piety, and Euthyphro fumbles around and finally comes to this formulation, well, it's what's pleasing to the gods. Socrates asks, is it pleasing to the gods because it's pious or holy? Or is it holy or pious because it's pleasing to the gods? And as if that's not enough to throw Euthyphro off, he says, and by the way, from our own tradition, our own literature, we know that the gods disagree about all sorts of things. If I do something that's pleasing to one god, but displeasing to another, is it pious? Is it holy? So referencing divinity proves not to be a simple solution for Socrates and his interlocutor. When religion of the sort that is practiced by Jews and Christians and Muslims enters onto the scene and dominates one culture after another, the question of something like that, what is the good or what is holiness or what is anything, takes on a very different angle of understanding, because then the reference point is a single God. And if I can understand what that single God thinks, let's say, justice is, then I've got the answer to my question. So it changes the angle of the discussion. But of course, one of the issues that we see reflected in human history as we move out of antiquity into the medieval period and beyond to our own time is that we develop not one, not two, not three, but actually many different versions of a monotheistic conviction that there is one God, that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-merciful, engaged and involved and interested in human affairs, and to whose words we look as a reference point for answering questions such as what is the good, what is justice, what is piety, what is holiness, and so on and so forth. And it may be that if the words, let's say, in the Torah and the Quran are not identical, then if I'm a Jew and my reference point is the Torah, and my friend's reference point is the Quran because my friend is Muslim, or my friend's reference point is the Gospels because my friend is Christian, right at the get-go, we might find ourselves in disagreement as to what the correct answer is to the question, because the words may be somewhat different in any of these three texts. And even within each of these three traditions, we will find disagreement based on different kinds of interpretation of what things mean. So in Genesis 6, for example, which is the biblical story of Noah, whom of course we also find in the Quran, it opens up with the statement, all the people on the world were evil, so God purposed to destroy them, except for Noah, who was a righteous man in his generation. And I look at that opening line and I say, what is evil? What does it mean to say they were evil? You may or may not be familiar with the Hollywood movie with Russell Crowe called Noah. All right, we get a nice Hollywood version of evil. They're dancing around. They're obviously lascivious, having sex. They're beating up on each other. They're just being, I don't know, wild and woolly. But that's a Hollywood interpretation. The point is that in the text of Genesis, if one pages back from chapter 6 all the way through to chapter 1, there is no definition of what evil is. So I come away from that text with two options. Why do we not have a definition? One option would be, well, maybe God gave a definition, but because tradition has it that Moses is, so to say, he's the Rasul, he is the prophet through whom the words of God have come down to us, that maybe he got distracted for a second. You know, a mosquito landed on his nose and he swatted it away and didn't hear when God actually defined evil. Well, that's a less likely understanding. A traditional Jew, Christian, or Muslim would not say that. The prophet is not likely to be distracted. The prophet is not likely to be wrong. So that leaves me another alternative, which is that God intentionally does not define evil, because then it obligates the reader, whether the reader is reading that text 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10 years ago, or today, not to assume we know what evil is, and to continue, and there you go, dialogue, to continue to discuss what it might mean, to see whether we can come to a conclusion. And as one moves through the course of the vast history of literatures, West and East, with which Fethullah Gulen became familiar, we understand that he understands this kind of transition between the idea of dialogue in Socratic terms and a different kind of dialogue if one is speaking across cultures, across nations, and across faiths. Because if my primary text of understanding is Quran and yours is Gospels, or mine is the Bhagavad Gita and yours is Quran, then we may find ourselves disagreeing about certain things, or rather coming to different conclusions. And the tricky thing about dialogue, when it is interfaith, is that often the phrase will be used, but what we're really talking about is my faith is actually correct and yours is not. Let's have a conversation so I can correct you, so I can draw you to the correct form of faith, which is my own. That's not true dialogue. That's I'm up here and you're down here. True dialogue, we're at the same level. So this is something that Fethullah Gulen is coming very strongly to understand in the 80s and the 90s. The notion that true interfaith dialogue must have as its starting point the following important principle, which then leads to others. The important principle is humility. When I talk about God, everything I say about God is a kind of metaphor. It's by analogy. It's an allegory. I say God is all great. I say God is all powerful. I say God is all good. I say God is all merciful. I say God is involved, interested in human affairs. All of those descriptives come from my human vocabulary and my human understanding. I cannot know in a rational, reasoned sense what those terms, what those concepts mean are to God itself. The best I can do is have an idea of what they mean to me, and I apply them to God, and I have to realize that they fall short of being absolutes, because I cannot know what good means in God's terms. I cannot know what powerful means in God's terms, or interested means in God's terms. I want to continue to try and figure out what those terms mean, but I cannot know. So with that in mind, if I understand that the basis for my understanding is ultimately my faith. So I was born into this faith and you were born into that faith. And our respective faiths offer slightly different understandings of this concept or that concept. That I am not in a position to say yours is wrong, mine is right. And you're not in a position to say yours is right and mine is wrong. It's a kind of absolute relativism or a relativistic absolutism. In dealing with the absolute, we understand that we, who as a species are not absolute, have to take half a step back from our absolute assertiveness that this is the way it is and realize it could be wrong. Or, more likely, my understanding could be 150% right for me. And yours, which is slightly different from mine, could be 150% correct for you. And indeed, if I think of God as the creator, as of course all of our traditions do, and I think of God as the creator of the creation, and I simply look around me at the physical creation, I realize no two trees are alike. No two leaves are alike. No two snowflakes are alike. Now, you guys are living in a region where you don't get as much snow as I do, or maybe none. But I can tell you that no two snowflakes are alike. By the way, we're not getting snow these days either, thanks to global warming. But no two humans are alike. So it would be odd indeed, and here I'm simply being rational, if God's expectation of how to access God were through only one singular path, when nothing else about our reality is singular. Everything is endlessly multifarious. So the fact that there are literally hundreds of different denominations of Christianity, for example, and fewer than that number, but many different denominations of Islam, of Judaism, different forms of what we label, although it's not entirely accurate as a term, Hinduism, and so on and so forth, that's actually more natural than that there would be only one or one correct way of accessing God. So that the notion of diversity and pluralism is something not to be eschewed or ignored or rejected or even reluctantly accepted, but something embraced as very much part of what God itself seems to have intended. Seems, I can't say, I don't know what God meant. Seems to have intended by the endless diversity that is visible in an obvious way in so many other aspects of the creation. So one of the features of Gulen's teachings in dialogue has to do with humility. It has to do with simultaneously, no, let me start that phrase again, being comfortable simultaneously with being what I am, which is my particular form of being a Muslim or my particular form of being a Jew. Because it's not even enough to say being Muslim or being Jewish, because there are too many ways, too many forms of being Muslim or being Jewish. Being comfortable with that at the same time that I'm comfortable with a range of other forms of faith that are not mine and don't feel that my faith is threatened by them or don't insist that my faith overwhelm them, but recognize the divine validity of their coexistence. When we speak of dialogue, there is another name that comes up, a name with which Gulen was familiar, and the name is Martin Buber. Martin Buber was a very secular Jew from Vienna, Austria, who at the university became interested in spiritual matters because he became interested in Hinduism and Buddhism. So he turned to the East and became so inspired that then he turned back to his own tradition and ultimately became known for a pile of books written on Hasidism which is the last phase of mysticism in the Jewish tradition, or the last phase of the Jewish mystical tradition. And in it, among other things, he talks about the obligation of the Hasidic community that considers itself pious, because that's what the word Hasid in Hebrew means, pious, that gathers around its leader who is called a tzaddik, and the word tzaddik means a just one or a righteous one. The obligation of the community to work with the tzaddik in order to improve the world, whether it's limited in scope to the world of that community, or whether more ambitiously it's thinking of the world more broadly. That you can't expect the leader to do it, but the group may feel that it can't quite accomplish it without the leader. We can't do it without the leader, without the tzaddik, but we can't just assume the tzaddik's going to take care of it on our behalf. Buber, in the late 1920s, ends up writing a book called I and Thou, and it's about dialogue. And the interesting thing is, it is, you might say, a secular religious document, because its starting point is Western existentialism that doubts or denies, depending how extreme, doubts or denies the existence of God, and claims that it's really, we're free of God. It's all on our shoulders. We have free will. We can do it all ourselves. So in his discussion of dialogue, he says, there are two ways of being in the world. One way is I, it. I, it means I see myself as an I, capital I, and I experience you as an it, as something that somehow accrues to my I's benefit. I don't acknowledge the fullness of who you are. I only acknowledge the fullness of what I am. And so I experience you. The other way of being in the world is I, thou, or I, you, in which he says, I recognize to the full your I-ness. As I am an I, so are you. As you are a you to me, I am a you to you. And this becomes not an experience, but a relationship, because it's fully circular, it's fully reciprocal. But the interesting thing where Buber goes with this, because there's nothing particularly inherently religious about this formulation, is that he says, and we can have I-thou relationships on different levels. Human to human, we are inclined to use words, but you can have a relationship of that sort with a non-human. Your dog, your cat, your plants, your pet rock. You can treat these other entities as an I, as a thou, and therefore acknowledge the I-ness of that other entity. But my relationship with my dog or my cat or my plant or my stone is not going to be verbal in the same way that my relationship with a person will be. And then the kicker is, he says, and remember, he's coming from an existentialist perspective that doubts or even denies God's existence. He says, and you can have an I-thou relationship with God, the God whom you don't believe exists. Because if, as an existentialist, you use your will for a moment to will yourself to suspend your disbelief, you'll find God on the other side of the table. You'll find God there. So he uses the very secular existentialist instrument of free will to consider how one can engage in a real relationship with God. So Gulen is also drawing from this kind of thinking about having that kind of relationship. And sandwiched in between the kind of dialogue idea of Socrates and the dialogue idea of Buber is a whole series of individuals in the Muslim tradition who are renowned as mystics, as Sufis. And one of the interesting things about Sufism and its siblings in the Jewish and Christian mystical tradition and in other traditions, as a mystical tradition, its goal in a nutshell is this. In a nutshell, what is my goal as a mystic? It's to become one with God. I believe that there's a hiddenness within God. That's what the word mysterion in Greek, which becomes mysterium in Latin, and mystic or mysticism or mystery in English. What it means, a hiddenness. I believe there's a kind of hiddenness of God that I can access. And my goal in doing that is, as a goal, to become filled with God so that I can barely distinguish myself from God. So mysticism has three challenges. Can I make that happen? Can I get outside of myself? Ecstasy. Ek in Greek means outside of. Stasis is a state of being, outside of where I stand, outside my state of being. Or is it that I have to go deeply into myself, because all the Abrahamic traditions present the idea of God as within all of us. A bit of God is in all of us. We call it soul, nafs, nefesh. So it may be that I have to go into myself to find God in there. But the triple challenge is, can I do that? Can I come back from that experience? Can I express what the experience was? Because that sort of an experience is going to transcend words. And the danger that I cannot can be extreme. You have the example in 922 of Muhammad al-Hallaj, a Sufi, who comes out of this condition of ecstasis, and he's yelling, Ana al-Haq, Ana al-Haq, al-Haq. And you all know Haq, which is truth, is one of the 99 names of God. It's one of the 99 descriptives that we offer in the Muslim tradition of trying to express and explore and explain a God that is beyond expression, exploration, and explanation. So he's assumed to have apostatized. They execute him. Because if someone's running around saying, I'm God, they think that is being an apostate. Of course, that's not what he's saying. It's that he hasn't been able to disentangle himself from God. And that's why he's yelling that. So the three challenges also offer three dangers. If I can't come back, I've either dropped dead, or I've gone crazy, or I've apostatized. Muhammad al-Hallaj is viewed to have apostatized. He didn't, but he's viewed that way. But I could. Or I could just go crazy, because mysticism is so fraught with paradox and things that don't make rational sense. So there are all kinds of warnings about not doing this stuff. In the rabbinic tradition, there's an allegorical tale of four big shot rabbis who entered what's called in Hebrew the Pardes. And Pardes is actually a borrowing from Persian, either directly or by way of Greek, but that's another story. Pardes, that means orchard or garden or something of that sort, that is understood to be the garden of mystical reflection. Four big shot rabbis enter the garden. One looked and dropped dead, one looked and went mad, one looked and apostatized. Only one of them, Akiva, went in peace and returned in peace. So the idea is these big shot rabbis have a 1 in 4 chance, 25% chance of surviving the mystical experience without destruction. So you and I, who are less than they, is the idea, really shouldn't even go there at all. It's something that's discouraged. But the fact of the matter is, the rewards of the mystical experience, if I can achieve it, are profound. That's why I want to do it, even though I'm being discouraged by my mainstream leadership, religious leadership, not to. It's too dangerous. My goal is to be filled with Godness. And therefore, my goal cannot be, I want enlightenment. I want to become enlightened. That's too ego-filled. That's all about me. My goal has to be to go, come back, and improve the world of which I'm part. That's got to be my goal. I don't become a mystic for myself. I have to become a mystic for my community. As I said, it could be as small as, my group of 11 fellow dervishes, or Hasidim, or it could be the entire world. The point is, it can't be about me. And one of the consequences of that, is that mystics, more often than not, are inclined to be universalistic, even as they are what they are. So Ibn Arabi, for example, or Rumi, for example, just to name two in the Sufi tradition, who are particularly near and dear to Fethullah Gulen and to myself, I should say, as well, repeatedly write things that reference the simultaneity of I am an intense, dyed-in-the-wool, pious Muslim on the one hand. Call me anything else and I'll call you a liar, Rumi says. And on the other, Rumi says, I go into a church, a mosque, a synagogue, I see one altar. And other sorts of things that suggest his understanding of how co-equal as instruments for trying to access God the various traditions are. Because if I empty myself of ego, which is what I've got to do if I'm to be filled with Godness, I can't be filled with God if my ego is filling me. I've got to somehow get rid of it. The danger is I can't get it back. That's what happened to Muhammad al-Khalaj. But I have to empty myself of self. Then I'm more likely than not to understand that my conviction that mine is the only correct form of faith is my ego speaking and not God speaking. So Gulen is engaged across time and space with all of these different thinkers. And again, I'm just talking essentially of spiritual ones at this moment, but I remind you of his intense engagement, not only with physicists and chemists and people like Einstein, but people like Said Nursi, another Turkish thinker who is himself engaged with science and the outside world and synthesizing it with his understanding of Islam. He's not only engaged with all of these different kinds of thinkers, but he's activating that engagement by way of the discussions, first of all, that he's having in the coffee shops around him. And second of all, as his vision becomes broader and broader in what he begins to shape and what he begins to inspire as what we call the Hizmet movement. Hizmet meaning service in Turkish. And again, his beginning point, not surprisingly, because that's where he can operate at the outset, is Turkey itself. So one of the first things that he starts to engage in is to create schools. And not just to create schools where everything from physics to language to literature to math to science to art to sports is encompassed. In fact, the only thing not being taught in the schools that, inspired by him, start to be established all over Turkey, hundreds of them, the only thing they don't teach is religion. Because, first of all, it's a secular state. So it would be against the law to actually be teaching religion. And second of all, his conviction comes to be the connection to one's faith is going to come naturally by way of one's engagement in these schools. Because if I've got a bunch of teachers and administrators who are not operating on a 9 to 5, 5-day-a-week or 6-day-a-week basis, but are operating, from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., that are there all the time for their students, that are engaged with them all the time, every day, that even when they go home, if a student needs them, they're available. That kind of model is going to inspire me. And I can't not notice that the individuals who are functioning as my teachers and the administrators of my school happen to be pious Muslims. They're not wearing it in the literal sense. They're not wearing it on the outside because that's still illegal in the Turkey of which we are speaking. But they're manifesting it so clearly. And they're making very clear that what they are individuals who love everybody And the reason for that is actually very simple. If they are connected to Hizmet, which has certain roots in Sufism of the Rumi sort, then they surely, as pious Muslims of that sort, love God. And if I love God, and God created not just me and not just my group, but everybody and everything, and I understand that God loves everyone and everything, then I've got to love everyone and everything. I can't just pick and choose according to convenience or prejudice or what I happen to be born into and grow up in. So these schools are taking shape as an extraordinary phenomenon. But there's more. You can talk the talk. How do you walk the walk? How do you transform thought and words into action that really helps improve the world? Because one of the things that Gulen realizes is that there are myriad would-be students, particularly from the part of Turkey where he originated, Eastern Turkey, Anatolia, who, sure, they could somehow make their way to Izmir or to Istanbul to go to one of these schools. How are they going to survive? It's expensive to live in Izmir. So he begins to formulate an even larger kind of picture of how these schools should function by creating dormitory settings. So you come from some obscure town in northeastern Anatolia toward the Black Sea, up in the Trebizond area, let's say, and you come to Izmir and you have a place to stay. And you have people who will help you. He develops a system not just of schools with an appendage called a dormitory, but in the dormitory there is going to be someone who is maybe just a few years older than the kids who are in the dormitory and knows a little bit more about Islam, about the teachings of Fethullah Gulen, about math, about physics. And that individual becomes a kind of mentor for, let's say, the group of 6 or 8 or 10 younger kids who are in that dorm. And so they call him in Turkish an abi, if it's a he, right? Which means literally it's a kind of uncle, or an abla if it is a she. So by the way, this is not just for men, it's for women. It's not just for boys, it's for girls. So his, excuse me, his system is designed to try and offer service, Hizmet, to the entire being, and not just the brain, or not just the body, but the brain and the body, and not just the brain and the body, but the heart and the soul of the individuals who end up encompassed by the system. One of my favorite stories about him, well, there are 2 favorite stories I have about him. The first is one of how he lived his life when he was just functioning as an imam, which is in the system in Turkey, the imam is entitled to certain, the English word would be, I'd say, emoluments, certain things, a certain amount for your food, for your drink. You live in a facility sponsored or paid for by the mosque and so on. He refused. He had an imam's salary, but he would take no food, no drink. He would not take from the mosque funds monies to provide for his accommodations either. It all somehow came out of him. And there was a long period in which he was actually essentially living in the mosque. Some of these big Turkish mosques have large window shelves. You've got a window and then you've got a sort of a place which often are lined with books. Well, he would lay down his mat and that's where he would sleep, so as not to provide any financial inconvenience to the mosque. So that's one aspect of who he is that I think is fascinating. The second, which is more to the point of how he was developing the school system, is the story of his going to one of his early-ish patrons. And he visited him. And the patron lived in a home with 3 bedrooms, well furnished. And Gulen says, "So you have 3 bedrooms?" He says, "Yes." "Well, what are they for?" "Well, this one, of course, is for my wife and me. This one is for my younger son who lives with us still. He's at home. And this is my older son's bedroom. He's off working in another city right now, but we keep the bedroom for him. And Fethullah Gulen says, well, then you don't need the furnishings from that third bedroom. I want them for my dormitory. And the guy said, okay, done. So not only is this someone who is wise, someone who is knowledgeable, someone who is incredibly humble, and it just exudes from him. I've met him a number of times, humility, but also very charismatic in numbers of different ways, not just as a speaker, as a preacher, as a teacher, as a religious inspirer, but just in that kind of a day-to-day interaction where without a lot of difficulty, he can convince someone to part with a substantial chunk of material possessions that really he doesn't need in order to help facilitate the system that he's developing of schools. So initially, because it's simpler that way, the schools are being developed in Turkey itself. But gradually, the graduates of those schools are starting to reach out. And initially, it was to the various Turkic countries not far from Turkey, such as Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and soon not just to those which are Turkic Muslim countries, but Armenia, Greece, countries that don't have a traditionally very positive relationship with Turkey at all. And ultimately, further to the east, as far, of course, as India, and beyond India, as far east as Indonesia and the Philippines and so on, and across Europe, North Africa, the United States, Canada, Central and South America, Australia, New Zealand, that an amazing array of Hizmet schools develops across the world in 170 countries, hundreds and thousands of these schools. And what are these schools doing? They're teaching, they're guiding, they're leading students to recognize the importance of being a human being among human beings, as opposed to a Christian among Christians, a Jew among Jews, a Muslim among Muslims, a human among human beings. They're teaching the importance of thinking and speaking and being comfortable with dialogue across different lines of culture, of nationality, and of faith, but also of applying the theory of this to the action of helping improve the world. One of my favorite stories, I keep giving you favorite stories, forgive me. One of my favorite stories in this context pertains to a school that I visited in Sydney, Australia. And the school had a large area to the right of the building, which I noticed had a lot of vegetables growing there. And I asked, and it turns out that the 11th and the 12th graders at that school are tasked, and every year it's going to be another group, obviously, with cultivating an organic vegetable garden, a substantial one. This wasn't small, it was fairly large. So first of all, they developed through that experience and understanding and empathy for what it takes to produce crops. You know, I go to the supermarket, I go to the market, and I buy them, and I don't think twice about where they come from. But the farmer was worrying minute by minute, you know, about the weather, about rain, about sun, about wind, about insects, about animals that would come and eat at them, rabbits or what have you. So they have a much, to repeat, more empathetic understanding of what it takes to produce this sort of stuff. And then what they're doing with the vegetables is they're selling them in the neighborhood, because you can't get organic vegetables in that neighborhood anywhere. And then they take the profits and they send them, and the year I was there, it was Mali. They send them to a community that they have researched in Africa, So this was a village in Mali that did not have easy access to clean water. So people would have to go some distance with, large pots on their head to fill with water and bring them back. They provided the funds to dig a well and a piping system that would give that village clean water, obviously hygiene, cooking, all sorts of ways in which we don't even think about it. Clean water is a necessity. So from beginning to end, this is an exercise in repairing the world. It's an exercise in translating theory into action. It's an exercise in understanding about different groups in different parts of the world, close and far. And it's developing human beings who are going to be concerned about human beings and about the world, and not just about themselves or not just about some small group. So the Hizmet movement, as one might call it, continues to evolve over the course of the time between the 90s and now, so the last, give or take, 30 years, not only to help solve the problem of ignorance by creating education, the problem of poverty by creating instruments that alleviate poverty, but also the problem of strife by creating dialogues. Within all of these Hizmet-run schools, the students are a diverse population, not all Muslim. So even at that level, you have interface among different cultures, faiths, nations, expressed in the school system, if I can call it that. That's a little bit too formal. It's a little bit looser than that. But also, as Hizmet became more and more present in more and more countries, and my primary experiences of that are in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, to be honest, and Turkey itself, rather than my having a personal acquaintance with the Hizmet programs all over the planet. I know about them, but in terms of my personal connection to them, it's more limited. But they're also engaged in social programs. In the United States, for example, where everybody likes to celebrate Thanksgiving, on the last Thursday in the month of November, it's traditional. There's certain foods that are traditional, right? So everybody talks about eating a turkey and this stuffing and this, that, and the other thing. Certain kind of pies have somehow become traditional. So one of the things that Hizmet engages in across the United States is involvement with groups like themselves that are do-good groups in providing packages for people who either can't get out of their house to go buy the turkey, or are too impoverished to be able to afford the turkey, or spending time on Christmas Day, let's say, working as physicians' aides in hospitals so that Christian physicians' aides can take the day of Christmas off and celebrate Christmas with their family. So a whole range of these kinds of programs, and of course, dialogues. So Hizmet's dialogue program, I guess I'd call it that, comes in a number of different flavors. The most, to my mind, interesting and exciting one, across many countries, I won't say all because I don't know whether that's true, but certainly the countries I've visited and others beyond where I visited, are to create interfaith iftar dinners. So in the course of the give or take the month of Ramadan, so you break fast with iftar, as you all know. But if instead of just breaking fast with iftar within the family or within the community, we invite those from outside the community. So I've been to many, many iftar dinners for which the people enjoying the food are not just Muslims, they're Jews, they're Christians, they're Hindus, a whole range. And that, of course, offers two opportunities. One, it's simply a truism of how we function as a species. that we're more likely to get to know each other and get into conversation in the informal setting of a meal and with a nice meal in our bellies than in some more formalized, okay, let's gather for a dialogue now. You can do that, but there's something more natural about letting that happen in the context of an iftar dinner. And it also offers the opportunity in a very light-handed manner, because I've done this, I've spoken at many iftar dinners, where you have a range of different people who are speaking briefly. I'm usually the one tasked with talking about Fethullah Gulen and talking about the Hizmet movement, but there's usually a priest who may give the benediction before, some rabbinic figure who's going to make some comment, let's say, about the relationship between fasting and feasting in the Jewish tradition and so on. So it becomes an opportunity to educate a broader audience that is made up more likely of adults. So it's not the kids whom you got in school, it's the adults, it's their parents, it's their grandparents, it's people without kids, it's people who are interested, and it immeasurably broadens the interconnections among these different communities. And I've seen these operative all over the country. And as I said, in Australia, New Zealand, as well. Those are my primary points of contact. One of the things that I found most extraordinary and inspiring in a conference that I attended last year, it's almost a year ago, it was last February or March, I've forgotten exactly, in Los Angeles. It was an international Hizmet conference, and the conference had not been held in a number of years, largely because of COVID and so on and so forth. Was that at that conference, there were perhaps 36 speakers overall. And most of them were giving reports on Hizmet projects in which they had been involved, whether it was building a school, whether it was creating a water system, whatever it was. There were Hizmet people reporting from Central America, from South America, from Australia, from New Zealand, from different parts of Europe, from parts of Africa, from Greece. That was my favorite. Again, my favorite. Because here you have Hizmet operating, and the guy who was reporting on this was not a Turk, he was a Greek, an Orthodox Christian Greek who was so drawn to the teachings of Gulen and to the meaning of Hizmet that he was involved with Hizmet in a project there in Greece, which, as I need not tell you, does not have an overly happy history over the last couple of centuries with Turkey. So to me, it all suggested and symbolized the vast and fascinating array of ways in which Hizmet has been active across the world in improving the world. I started out by talking about Gulen and his evolution from a kind of Turcocentric, Islamocentric thinker to a universalist who is no less pious as a Muslim than he was before he became universalist, whose thinking involves and engages in a whole range of directions, dialogue being a starting point, but it's only the starting point. So I've arrived now at talking about or referencing projects without giving details, except the one I gave you of the school, projects that Hizmet groups have been engaged in across the planet. But that's also, I'm still talking about dialogue. Because obviously, anytime and every time you are engaged in some sort of project, whatever it is, whether it is an iftar dinner or a water system, you're talking and you're likely to engage. And you realize that the guy that I'm working with to prepare those Thanksgiving packages, who happens to be a Turkish Muslim, and I'm an American-born Jew or an American-born Christian, and whatever prejudices I might have had in my head or in my heart before I began to engage in this kind of project, and I find myself partnering with someone who is not from where I come, means that I'm having a dialogue even without ever using the word, without ever formally entering into by the way, what do you guys think about death? This is what we think. It might go that way depending upon the kind of people we are, but it doesn't have to. So you and I, alas, live in a world that has exceeded, I think, the degree to which we as a species have torn each other and the world apart repeatedly for thousands of years. I do not believe as a species we have yet matured enough emotionally and psychologically. We have matured technologically. We can send a spaceship to moon. We can find a vaccination for COVID with extraordinary speed, but we're still again and again in this place and that, fighting over the same sorts of issues, the issue of religion, the issue of politics interwoven with each other, the issue of money, of economics interwoven with politics and religion, all ultimately coming back to the problematic of power and ego. If you think about someone like Mr. Erdogan, or Mr. Netanyahu, or Mr. Putin, or Mr. Trump, there's someone in India, I won't say his name because I don't know who's listening. These individuals seek power for the sake of power. Their concern is for themselves, however they mask it in a pretense of concern for a particular group of people. They use groups of people by somehow deluding them into imagining that their particular condition is going to improve, without thinking, first of all, that if mine improves at the expense of others, then at best it's short term. Much less thinking about whether there's something legitimate about mine improving at the expense of others, or might it not make better sense for all of us to improve together? Such individuals, alas, abound in greater numbers than at any time in, I think, human history. I'm reminded of the 1930s, where the fascism of Franco and Mussolini and Hirohito and Hitler and Stalin threatened to engulf the world in flames. And indeed, it did engulf the world in flames. But fortunately, there are enough people to put those flames out. So an event like World War II could come to an end. We live in a time where things could not be more horrific. And they could not be more horrific across the planet and in particular places across the planet. Whether it is Ukraine, whether it is the southwestern border of the United States, whether it is Sudan, whether it is Yemen, whether it is Indonesia, whether it is China, or whether it is Gaza. And of course, front and center in all of these and their other flashpoints. Front and center, certainly, Gaza presents itself because of what has been happening from there and to there since October 7th. And I bring that up to read to you just a brief part of an article that was put out by Reuters a couple of days ago, which is the explanation for why and what Hizmet can do and does do. Doesn't mean it's the only organization that does this. Fortunately, there are also other organizations that do this. But my topic is Hizmet. And Hizmet emphatically and in particular is engaged in trying to put out these kinds of fires. So the article reads in part, Jason Holtzman, he is the head of a Jewish community organization, the Jewish Community Relations Council in Philadelphia, and Mohammed Said Selmanlar, who is the head of Peace Islands Institute, Pennsylvania, which is a Hizmet organization. They met in April at an interfaith iftar, the meal eaten to break the day-long fast during the Muslim observance of Ramadan, at Philadelphia's City Hall, right, which is kind of the symbolic center of the Philadelphia political world. And they struck up a friendship. When Selmanlar's wife took a job in New York this summer, Holtzman helped Selmanlar explore towns across the river in New Jersey where the couple might relocate to split the commute, because he'll be in Philadelphia working, she'll be in New York working. they're about an hour and a half apart. So if you had a home in New Jersey, you'd be in between. That way, neither of them is doing the long commute, but they'd be splitting it. When the news broke of Hamas's October 7th surprise terror attack in southern Israel, one of the first people Holtzman, director of Philadelphia's Jewish Community Relations Council, heard from was Selman Lar. Quote, I said, look, what's happening now, it's probably going to get worse and worse. This was just the 7th, right? And I'm so afraid. I'm so worried about hate happening in our community, especially anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim hatred, said Selman Lar, executive director of Peace Islands Institute, a non-denominational organization founded by Muslims inspired by the teachings of the Turkish Islamic scholar Fethullah Gulen. Relationships like Selman Lar and Holtzman's have helped to sustain ties across all the metropolitan area at a time when Philadelphia's Jewish and Muslim communities in particular are suffering a spike in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidents. Then in parentheses, it says, in 1 week in late December, 13 Jewish sites across Philadelphia received bomb threats, end of parenthesis. Holtzman is speaking. On October 7th, I heard from Christian and Muslim community leaders expressing sorrow about what had happened, checking on me to make sure if I was okay personally, and since then, we've received plenty of support from members of the non-Jewish community, said Holtzman. After they spoke, Selman Lar and Holtzman convened a group of about 15 Jewish and Muslim community leaders to discuss a path forward. There's a lot of work to do, and these conversations that we are having are extremely sensitive, said Holtzman. But we've brought the group together to talk about the rise of anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim bigotry and what we can do in our own community in Philadelphia and the greater Philadelphia area to push back against some of the hate, end quote. The group, composed of both clergy and lay people, including those who have direct ties to the war zone, has yielded conversations that are personal and emotional. Even so, said Selman Lar, it's gone even better than we thought. All of the topics we discuss are really tough. The good intention is there. And therefore, we are trying to build our relationships better so we can help build something better for our community. And so the article goes on. So Selman Lar, and his surname actually sounds not Turkish, but Indian, right? Lar is the place, indicates, well, it doesn't matter. It's interesting. I don't know the details of his background. But the point is that he's the first one to pick up the phone because the dialogue that has begun on a personal level, that then becomes more of a group level dialogue, is one that he recognizes and that Holtzman recognizes has to persist, particularly in times such as these of difficulty. I was at a meeting in late October. It was actually a meeting to talk about the future of Hizmet. But one of the people who was at the meeting was a Muslim woman whom I know well because we actually edited a book together. She's not part of Hizmet, though. And I say that for a reason, because she was in the middle, sort of toward the late part of the meeting, she just out of left field brought up something that was clearly sitting on her shoulders the whole time, her upset, because there was a meeting scheduled about October 15th or so of a group, this is in Virginia, called Salam Shalom, of Muslim and Jewish women. And they had decided not to meet because of what was going on in Gaza. You know, we just can't meet now. And of course, my response to her was, it's exactly now that you have to be meeting, because what is happening there only becomes more tragic if we allow it to inform the relations among groups across the planet that are informed by their religious convictions, which include being upset at what's happening politically and what's happening in terms of death and devastation, regardless of to what group or which individuals. So Hizmet has, as I have observed in that time since, been at the forefront of the movement to have meetings the movement to have conversations, the movement to have dialogue, that does not pretend that we have everything in common, but recognizes how much more in common we have than the ideas that divide us. And that ultimately brings us back to the starting point of what I was saying about Gulen's thinking, that we are humans, first and foremost. And our particularized differences can coexist with our profound understanding and appreciation of being human and part of a larger phenomenon, which is not just humanity, but ultimately the planet and all of its beings. So those are my thoughts, and I'd love to open things up to questions. I think we have, by my clock, 43 minutes for questions. So ask some good questions, if you have any. And if you don't, ask them anyway.
So we still have a solid 40 minutes left. Anybody who has a question may raise their hand, please.
Don't be shy.
Okay, Pragya,
Yes.
yeah.
Pragya. You have to, yes.
Hi, Professor Soltes. This is probably the third time I'm hearing you, and so I absolutely love the way you shared the stories. So I have a comment and a question. So I think that the comment is it's very uplifting to hear about Mr. Gulen. This is the first session after the new year because we were on a winter break. And the reason is that we keep we're always told that one person cannot change the world, and I think that his entire life is proof that if a person has conviction and wants to, we all can. And I think it's very uplifting to hear about him, like, first in the first session of 2024. So that was, of course, the comment. And I'm always curious about his interpretations of Islam. Like, obviously, you mentioned that there was a lot of dialogue that that he himself has had with different religious leaders, and he's obviously and you also mentioned about the fact that um, there's no particular definition of evil, but it's a journey of discovery. So that was, of course, one of the things that is obviously different from what traditional scholars of Islam, interpret it as. Um, is there something? Are there some other things that stand out in his interpretation of Islam vis-a-vis the traditional scholars that you would like to talk about? That's something that I'm curious for.
Okay. Yeah. Two things. The first, to respond to your first comment, we can't all be Fethullah Gulen. Not all of us will have the kind of impact he has ended up having. I mean, I can speak for myself. I've written, I think, 28 or 29 books and hundreds of articles, and I teach students, I lecture all over the place. I hardly have the kind of impact that Fethullah Gulen has. I mean, there's a very small number of people who know of my existence, right? But there is a passage in the rabbinic tradition that says, the day is short, the work is long, the master is urgent, the master being God. It's not incumbent upon you to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. So the teaching, of course, is that if I say, well, I can't have the kind of effect that Gulen has, so I'm not even going to try because I can never get there, that's the wrong approach. The approach is, but maybe I can, in my own corner of the world. I mean, I'll give you a silly, almost banal little example of my personal improving of the world on this tiny, tiny level. I walk my dog in the morning, and one morning it was raining, and I realized that the newspapers are delivered to the curb, and the door of the houses that I'm passing as I walk my dog is maybe 40 feet away, you know? And I have two elderly neighbors. And I thought, these ladies should not have to come out in this rain to pick up their paper. So I took the paper from the curb and put it by their door. And then I started doing it every day, even when the weather was nice. Just so we joke about me as their local paper boy, you know, and I joke that they don't tip me well, you know, all that, so it goes back and forth. But the point is, it's tiny. It's something I can do, and it's not a big deal, right? Obviously, as a teacher, I can hope, particularly teaching at a place like Georgetown, in the School for Foreign Service, where I have students literally from all over the world. And if you're a student from another country coming to Georgetown, that's almost a guarantee that you're part of the upper crust in the country you come from, which means when you grow up, when you graduate, it's likely that you will be in some position of leadership. So if a student like that is in my class and thinks about things differently than he or she did before, and that ends up being remembered when that student becomes a leader, then I don't even know it, but I've had some sort of an effect. So I'm lucky, at least, that I have that potential. But the point is, even if I don't, I shouldn't be worrying about whether I'm going to have an effect. I should be just doing things as I should do them. And by the way, I left out a very important detail of Hizmet and Gulen's preaching about it. And that is, and this is, in a sense, I'm getting in part to your question, altruism. His insistence is not just that one does, but that one does without the expectation of some sort of a payback. The payback is that I know I've done something good for someone else, not that I'm expecting anything from that person. And when I first became interested and involved with Hizmet, first of all, it tended to be referred to, and in some circles it still is, as the Gulen movement. And I remember suggesting at the first conference I attended, I don't think there's got to be a better word, because I'm thinking of an American audience, right? That's where this conference was. That sounds like a cult. So you've got to come up with something better. And obviously other people thought that too, because now most people refer to it as Hizmet, which means service. It's inspired by him, but they don't use his name. And he's the last person in the world who would want his name to be used, because he is that modest and that humble. But also a word that was being used was tolerance. And I said, that's not a good word. Tolerance means I'm up here and you're down here, and I will permit you to be what you are, to think what you are, to say what you are. I'm tolerating you. It's got to be this, and it's got to be more affirmative. My first book on him was called Embracing the World. And then someone piped up, a Turk, and said, well, it's a bad translation of hoşgörü. And hoşgörü can be translated as seeing the world from in someone else's eyes. So his teaching about dialogue and the action that follows from it is based on the concept. It's an I-thou concept, but carried to an extreme, that I see the world from within your eyes. So I can distinguish him readily from just about anyone in Islamic leadership across the Muslim world today, in that his teaching is not about political Islam. His teaching is about civil and civic Islam. His teaching is about what Islam teaches about how to be a better person, not about how to be a more dominant polity. This is one of the most obvious distinctions between him and Recep Erdogan, for whom Islam is an instrument to further him politically, whereas Gulen's idea is that Islam is an instrument to further all of us, socially, economically, intellectually, spiritually. And that distinguishes him from all of those. There are other Muslim thinkers, both inspired by him and apart from him, who have thought along similar lines, but I'm not aware of anywhere within the Islamic tradition in which the notions that he promotes are spelled out as clearly as he does. Everyone knows the word jihad. And anyone who knows anything about the word jihad knows that the word jihad means struggle. And everyone knows, who they really know about jihad, that the popular usage of the word is an abuse of the word. That one can speak of jihad in terms of military struggle, but that's a tertiary meaning. The secondary meaning would confine my sense of jihad, of struggle, to the Muslim world itself, to the ummah. And the primary meaning of jihad is struggle with myself to make myself a better Muslim, because the word Muslim, as I'm saying it even though you all know it anyway, is someone who submits to God's will. So my constant struggle to try and understand what evil is and what good is, and to try and understand the ins and outs of what zakat is, and not just allow it to be reduced to, all right, it's my 10% or my 3% or whatever the percent is of my liquid cash, so I convert everything into real estate, so my liquid is less and therefore my zakat has to be less. But think of what the word really means, what it means. What it means to pray, right? So it's not just a matter of the number of rakats that I do 5 times a day as I pray 5 times a day, but the intention with which I pray. It's not that that can't be found elsewhere, but I'm not aware of anywhere within the Muslim tradition where all of these things are emphasized to the extent that they are for him. And by the way, my praying is something that is about me and my relationship with God. And as you know, I don't ever have to set foot in a mosque in order to pray. And if I do, I'm most likely to do so, Friday for the so-called noon prayer. So I remain part of a community because that's an ideal. And it may be the case that because I've hurt my knees, I can't even go down on my knees the way I have to do so if I'm traditional. So I'm sitting on a chair. That's also okay because it's about intention. It's not that that won't be found elsewhere. It's that Gulen is so emphatic in the way he talks about these sorts of aspects of being someone who submits to God's will, to being a Muslim. It's not about show. One of the things, forgive me, that I find most despicable about Erdogan is the times and places in which he will pray publicly so as to delude his constituents into imagining that he is a pious Muslim. And yet everything about him is the opposite of piety. But he wants to show that he is. So I'm half answering your question. I don't know if I'm fully answering, but Gulen, the kind of emphasis that he repeatedly has given over the years in teaching and preaching and writing, and what he exemplifies. I mean, one can only know that if one has met him. And I have to say, I'll tell you the story when I met him. I'd written my first book about him. I hadn't yet met him. And in a way, I didn't want to. I wanted my book to be based on just writings, his writings and writings about him. But then I met him, and I remember thinking after meeting him, when you meet someone whom you knew and admired from afar, maybe a sports hero or a political hero or something like that, and then you meet that person, and it's such a disappointment because they proved to be so much not like what the public persona was. When I met him, it was 180 degrees the opposite. He was much more than from my readings I could imagine in terms of his humility, in terms of his compassion for others, in terms of not just his knowledge, but his wisdom. It was spine-tingling. And I've seen him 4 or 5 times since, and it's always reconfirmed. I can only call it charisma, but that's too insufficient a word because it's so multivalent, his charisma. So that's what I have to say, further about him. And it's less that he differs from a mainstream Muslim interpretation of X, Y, and Z. First of all, there are divergent interpretations in any case of X, Y, and Z. But second of all, from within the community that would agree with him, there may be certain nuances that are different, but it's more the way in which He is insistent and systematic in teaching what he does and in translating, in helping those who listen and read what he has to say, helping them galvanize and energize themselves into translating their thinking into action toward improving the world.
No, thank you. That was very clarifying. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Pradya. Other questions, perhaps? No one?
Whoever has a question may raise their hands, please. Sonal?
Yes.
So
Tulka has a question. Sonal, go ahead.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Ori. I mean, that was one amazing session. I'm truly very mesmerized and truly like, oh my God, because you talked on my favorite topics like spirituality and all. I had a question, but in Pragya's questions answers, you have gave that question as an answer to that as well. My question was basically about the difficulties he might have faced doing his work, because it's not a cakewalk when you begin this kind of work for the community and for the people. And but yes, in your last sentence, you have you gave me the answer. But if you want to add some more to it, what kind of difficulties he faced and how he overcame that?
Thank you. First of all, as he was started to become well known, there were two groups of Turks who were very opposed to him. There were the secular Turks. The upper crust secular Turks, what are referred to as the white Turks. It's not a racial term, although the terminology comes out of Western colonial racial thinking, but it has nothing to do with skin color, the secularists. And then there was the Islamist Turks, so the secularists feared that he wants to turn Turkey into another Iran. And the Islamists feared, as time went on, or resented the fact that he was not only talking to the wrong kinds of Muslims and not just to the right kind, but to Christians, Jews, and non-Muslims. So the whole interfaith approach he took was terrifying to them. So he was constantly caught in a crossfire. And while he still lived in Turkey, through several regimes that saw as their point and purpose to maintain an army-affirmed, military-affirmed, because Ataturk, after all, was a military man, so the army was his strongest support, a firmly maintained secular society. And therefore, someone like him was a threat to that. There was a period, he spent time in prison a number of times. And there was a period when for 5 years he was kind of on the run from the authorities. And, he had friends who wanted to protect him. He said, no, I don't want anyone to be endangered by my situation. So he had all kinds of difficulties. He left Turkey in 1999 because he had a heart condition. And so he came to the United States for heart treatment. He's not gone back in part because his physicians have said, the stirring up in Turkey it's not good for your heart. But as you are no doubt aware, whereas when Mr. Erdogan, who had started out as the very successful mayor of Istanbul, began to approach the possibility of prime ministership, he received support from Gulen, because Gulen's conviction is that the most compatible political system for Islam is democracy. And Turkey has a democracy. And Erdogan seemed to be with him on the same page with respect to furthering it, stabilizing it, solidifying it with all the components that make democracy work. Its social scene, its economic scene, its cultural scene, and so on and so forth. So they were not close, but they were politically allied. And Gulen's ambition was never political, to repeat. It was civil. But he felt that they could work together. Once Erdogan achieved a sufficiently powerful position, there are two things that need to be noted. One, he made the comment, democracy is like a train. You have to know when to get off. So it turns out that his pretense of wanting to further Turkey's democracy was only a pretense. His intention, in which he has succeeded, was to crush it and to replace it with an autocracy in which he would have sole power. And between about 2005 and now, of course, he is very systematically and gradually engaged in that process. As soon as it became possible, he started to scapegoat Gulen and Hizmet because they posed to him a threat because of his conviction that Gulen must be politically ambitious, because I can't imagine anyone who isn't, because that's my middle name, political ambition. So he couldn't imagine that Gulen had no interest in competing with him politically. Gulen's only political interest was to further democracy in whatever way through his network he could help do that. So gradually, as you know, Erdogan began to shut down all of the Hizmet-founded schools, hundreds of them across Turkey. Now think of the implications of that. He is depriving those Turks most needful of those schools from those schools. He is depriving young Turks of the kind of education that the Hizmet-run schools were enabling them to have. But you understand that that's exactly what he wants to do, because he doesn't really care about Turkey. He cares about himself. I can stay more readily in power. I can delude you more readily the less educated and less thinking you are as an individual. I can snow you more easily than if you're educated and thinking. And of course, he gradually subverted the political system by way of the Turkish equivalent of the parliament, by way of the judiciary, facilitating the removal of those who opposed him from the judiciary. And so the entire judiciary follows his orders. And of course, the biggest challenge, which ultimately succeeded, was the army. In July of 2016, you're all familiar with this, I'm sure, there was an alleged failed coup against Erdogan, for which those accused of having fomented the failed coup was the Gulen-led Hizmet people, or as he calls them, Gulenists. And I remember when that coup happened, or when that non-coup happened, everything about it caused me to say, this was not a failed coup. This was a fake coup. This was something Erdogan himself engineered to give him the ultimate authority, the icing on the cake of his project of ridding himself of any kind of competition, for which he still thinks of Fethullah Gulen living in eastern Pennsylvania, thousands of miles away. And of course, he succeeded in presenting that illusion. It took me a couple of months to make another comparison between the event of July 2016 and something else. And the something else was in, I think it was February of 1933 in Germany. The Reichstag, which is the consummate symbol of the German polity, was burned. And Hitler, who had just come into power, managed, because he was already in the process of taking control of the media, to present it as something that had been done by the communists and the Jews. So he was permitted, therefore, to round up and jail the communists who were the only political opposition to his Nazi party. And it was the beginning of his increasingly formalized and systematic campaign against the Jews. And I thought, Erdogan's taken a page out of Hitler's book. He's created a fake coup, created the illusion that it was created, the coup, fake, by the Hizmet people. The Hizmeti are to him a combination of what the communists were and the Jews would be to him. And only more recently did I learn that Hitler is one of Erdogan's favorite leaders, that he keeps a copy of Mein Kampf, my battle, Hitler's book, close to himself at all times. So last thing, and then I'll see if I know Tulka has a question, and there may be others. Tulka has a question. My best friend is an avid reader of a publication called The New Yorker magazine. It's a big deal in the States. Very top-notch journalists. They publish poems. It's hard to get in there as a poet. Cartoons. It's very top of the line. And there was an article at the end of the summer in the New Yorker magazine about Gulen. And my friend brought it to me, said, I know you're involved with this guy. You got to read this article. It's really, really negative. And it was. And I realized this top-notch journalist failed as a journalist. He didn't check sources at all. He must have taken all the Turkish government sources. Erdogan could have written the article. So it was completely one-sided. And that's what inspired me, in fact, to write my next book about Gulen, or I was already working on it, but I was kind of taking my time. I got really, boom, it galvanized me to get it done very quickly, because I felt there needs to be something out there, and the more the merrier, that actually talks about what Gulen is about and what Hizmet is about, and not what Erdogan and the Turkish media that he controls say Gulen and Hizmet is about. So it's been a very long struggle. And of course, for the members of Hizmet after July 2016, it was an enormously depressing moment. Where are we going from here? And eventually Erdogan has extended his tentacles. By bullying or by bribery, he's shut down Hizmet-run schools in all sorts of countries as well. The effect always is to disadvantage the population where those schools are shut down. But it's part of his relentless campaign to destroy Hizmet, which has actually not only failed, at least in the States and Australia, New Zealand, which is the places with which I'm most conversant, it's backfired, because it's put Hizmet on a map in the way it wasn't before. So there are more non-Muslims, non-Turks, non-Hizmet people who are at least interested in hearing about it than before, who didn't even know it existed. So that's my long-winded answer to your question, Sonal. Thank you. Tulka, you had a question. Your hand was up, right? Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Sir, first of all, thank you so much for all the kind words and wisdom. So my question was very similar to what Sonal and what Pragya ma'am asked. My thing was, when I read about the Hizmet movement, so I found that they have been criticized a lot, in the sense like a cult which is even like stronger or influential than Illuminati. So basically, out of like in all these situations, when this person or this moment is being criticized, how do they manage to be human among human beings, like you said in one of his teachings, right? So that would be my question. Plus this thing about being in the two ways of being in the world, which is I and it and I and thou. So what I could understand with it was, I and it is basically how, when I consider you different from me, and I and thou is when I find no differentiation between you and me. Like we are a part of one whole. Okay, so I had a confusion in that. So now that's clear.
Sure.
But yeah.
I would say no differentiation, but recognizing that the differences are part of the beauty of what we are as a species. All maple trees, and they've got them not in India, but in the United States, so it's a species with which you may not be familiar, but all maple trees are maple trees, and they can be identified as such because they have a particular kind of bark and a particular shape of their leaves, and their leaves turn particular shades in the autumn of gold and red. But no two trees are alike, and no two leaves are alike. So I think of humans in that kind of a way. No two of us are alike, and yet we are all identifiable as humans because of the things we have in common. And it's not just our physical attributes, but our spiritual and our mental attributes. And yet no two of us physically are exactly alike, and no two of us mentally are exactly alike. So I wouldn't say I, thou effaces the differences. It appreciates the differences and subsumes them into a larger sense of commonality. As for how one maintains one's one's humanity, and particularly against those who are trying to dehumanize you. That was the first challenge I heard Gulen taking up in the aftermath of the July 2016 false coup. I attended a Hizmet retreat in December of Hizmet people from around the area in which I live, Washington, Maryland, what have you. And they go for 4 days to a hotel and they hear talks and they eat together, they pray together, and so on and so forth. And there was someone who spoke who came from the place where Gulen lives. Gulen was not traveling himself, but he talked about there are 2 or 3 things that jump into my mind. One, he talks about the importance of patience. The Turkish word, it's actually a borrowing from Arabic, is sabr, I guess S-A-B-R, patience, that one must be patient. He talked about faith in God, that ultimately it will work out. And since most members of Hizmet are believers in God, because one could argue, what about us secularists who don't believe, or us atheists who don't believe in God, right? Well, true, then that's not a path that's going to work for you. But for someone who does, Gulen's teaching and preaching conveyed by one of his right-hand people at that retreat was, it will work out. You just have to have faith, but it's going to take a long time. He went so far as saying, if Erdogan came around and said, I'm not doing this anymore, and I apologize for what I did, I would have no interest in revenge. I would have no interest in punishing him even. I would accept that. I don't think that's going to happen, by the way, but that's his perspective. In my own experience, which is in a sense more to your point, where I have spoken at the invitation of Hizmet groups, in 3 or 4 different countries, probably, 60 or 70 different times, is every time and every place where I've encountered Hizmet people, with one exception, the rule has been an unqualified generosity, humility. What can I do for you? Wanting to make sure, in every way, shape, and form that I am comfortable, that my needs are met. And the one exception is what actually I love, because it proves the rule. There was one time I went to speak in Kansas City, and the guy who was my host there, Hizmet person, was very clear. He didn't give a damn about me, my welfare. How can we squeeze out of this guy what we need? We needed to speak here, there. He did not have my interest in mind at all. It was so palpable. And I thought, that's good. Because if every single Hizmet person acted in this altruistic way, it's like, okay, what acting school are they going to? Because it can't be real. But the fact that there could be someone who was so not like that made it clear to me that all those others who are genuinely are. And I, at this point, I have encountered scores of Hizmet people. And that kind of generous, self-effacing, altruistic, trying to improve the world perspective is something I've seen demonstrated again and again and again. So my confidence is that the Hizmet movement has found, can find, will find a way, in the face of the kind of difficulties that I've outlined, whether those difficulties pertain specifically, but it's past now, to what happened to Gulen or what's happening in the present. I just exchanged emails with a Hizmet friend of mine in Tbilisi, Georgia. There's a university there, International Black Sea University. And with the exception of the COVID year, I think for maybe the last 6 or 7 years, I've gone there every summer for about a week to teach an intense week-long course on the American novel, okay? It's run by Hizmet people, largely. They founded it. And what I've said about Hizmet people is what I also encountered there again and again. But this correspondence about a week ago with my buddy from there said, the Georgian government is going to take over control of the school. So I'm not sure, some of us may be out. I'm not sure if the administrator currently, the dean who currently is the one who officially invites me to come speak there, is still going to be around. By the way, she's Georgian, she's not Turkish. Erdogan put pressure on the Georgian government. Georgia is Turkey's #1 trading partner, to close down the school 2 years ago. And that pressure failed because students and parents protested in the streets and the Georgian government backed down. So obviously the pressure has been upon them again. And what they have figured out as a kind of compromise is to keep the school running, but officially under the government's aegis rather than under the private aegis that it had had. So the difficulties have not by any means ended. And the efforts on the part of Erdogan to dismantle Hizmet in any way that he can continue. And he commands all the forces, whatever it is, that Turkey commands in order to make that happen. He has tried many times to extradite Gulen to Turkey. And Gulen has every time said, well, if the proper grounds for extradition are there, I'll go to Turkey. I'll face whatever kind of tribunal you want to set up, although I think he knows very well that it would not be a legitimate tribunal. But Erdogan has never been able to find anything vaguely resembling a legal, moral, or ethical reason for which the United States government should extradite Gulen. Because our government has done that, for example, with former Nazis who came into the United States after the war under false pretenses, and not till the 70s, 80s, 90s did their real pasts emerge. And there were, I don't know how many, a couple of dozen cases of former Nazis who were removed, who lost their American citizenship because they gained it under false pretenses, and then were extradited to various countries. But there's nothing that Erdogan has found or can find or will find about Gulen. But the problems, the difficulties continue. And the message is patience. And there are, from a few of my more recent conversations with Hizmet people, there are young people here in the United States, for example, who are kind of disinterested. Their parents are Hizmet, their grandparents are Hizmet, but they really don't want to be involved because they just feel too much pressure as a consequence of what has been going on. But there are very few of those, really, relative to the numbers, who not only stick with it, but are galvanized to do what Hizmet does, work with other people to improve the world, if that answers your question, Julka. Thank you.
So much, Professor Soltes. Zikra, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah.
Maybe
Hi.
on mute, but there we go.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a really wonderful lecture, and Happy New Year. It was really very nice to hear this topic about Fethullah Gulen and Hizmet. It's a very important topic because in dialogue is influenced with this movement. And my question was same as Tulika asked about the criticism of Hizmet movement, which is you beautifully answered it. So thank you so much. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Well, Aliyah, what do you think?
I was just reading, I'm really sorry that my memory does not serve me very nicely all the time, but one of the books that I was reading about Fethullah Gulen was, I read the part about his life, his early childhood, his, early adulthood, like the times he was working on his own, where he was doing the dishes on his own and cleaning clothes by himself and making,
Yes.
Meals for. Okay, so then it was John Paul. Yeah, okay.
It was either my book or John Paul's book. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was John Paul's. Yeah. Yeah. So, Pragya is also with us. She's our course coordinator. So, it was that book. I think it's the perseverance where you're doing everything on your own, but you have so much faith in whatever you have to offer, and you have so much conviction about whatever you believe in. Like, if you want to bring change into this world, like Mahatma Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. So he was actually practicing that. And that's why he was able to influence so many people through so many years. I think it must have been around 1950 that he was doing that. And it wasn't until 1990 that people started finding out about him. So it's that too. And when you meet him, like you said, I've also been associated with the Hizmet movement for the past 4 years now. It's just been 4 years. But the kind of people I've met has been life-changing for me. I think the time I met them, um, uh, by the way, Behzad Fatmi is my husband, and he's the one who introduced me to the Hizmet movement. I had lost all faith in humanity by that time. And it was a good thing that I'd known Behzad for at least 15, 17 years before we got married. We'd known each other from school. So I could really trust him when he spoke about this movement where, you find out ways to help the community, you find out ways to bring people together. It was a really nice thing. And to me, at that time, I didn't have that, international worldview at that time. I didn't think about interfaith dialogue at that time. For me, at that time, it was just about practicing my own faith. Like you said, all the pillars of Islam. If Islam says that you need to help the poor, you need to, bring relief to whoever needs it. The Hizmet movement had a solid way of how to get there, a very practical approach to self-fulfillment at the same time as, advancement in the community. And it could be anything. Like in India right now, we're in touch with, Hizmet in the UK, Hizmet in the US, and we are right now Hope and Action Foundation, that In Dialogue Foundation works with, is building a well in a far off village in Rajasthan in India. So it's that kind of influence that Hizmet is able to have on lives in India. People who would never even expect to find out about Fethullah Gulen or who he is or what his background is, are benefiting from his view.
Yes. Not that he cares that anyone knows who he is. He wouldn't care if after he's gone, no one remembers him, as long as they're doing Hizmet, Yeah. That's great.
What I feel.
Wonderful. Thank you.
It looks like we don't have any more questions. Munir has switched off his camera. Sukaina has disappeared. So, well, you can take that as a compliment. It was a really comprehensive and informative lecture, and nobody has any more questions anymore.
I was just, I'm just butting in, sorry. I just wanted to sort of also mention while you were talking about Erdogan, we have these rounds in India, you can actually see the president's house as a tour.
Yes.
And and so they told us that, until recently, until a few years back, like India's president's house, which was built by the British, by the way,
Yes.
was the largest. And then Erdogan built himself a even larger. So currently Turkish, the Erdogan's palace, as it's called,
Yes.
is the largest, head of the state's house.
By far, yeah.
Yes. So that itself kind of shows it's probably the opposite of Hizmet or whatever. It's just the fact that you're not supposed to rub your wealth in the face of others. You're supposed to. Zakat really. One of the speakers said that zakat really means purifying your wealth. So when you give a portion of it away, it becomes pure and it becomes clean again, and you can use it for yourself or for whatever, and then you don't feel guilt about being. So that's one of the reasons, and and that's that entire act of building a palace was the opposite of the tenets of Islam. So what
Well,
you mentioned about him wanting to show that he's pious, but in reality he's not. That
absolutely.
entire thing resonated with me, and I just thought I wanted to share this.
Thank you. And one of the ironies is Erdogan a number of times has made statements about the lavish way in which Gulen lives. Gulen lives in a single room. He lives in a single room. And if guests come to the compound where that room is located, like if I come as his guest, he will pay he will not allow the compound's funds to provide me with my meal. He will pay into the compound's funds so that I am provided with lunch. He has funds because, of course, he's written so many books. They're royalties. So the royalties get used for whatever. They're not used for him. He lives as modesty as one can imagine. So, yeah, point well taken. Thank you.
Yeah, that resonates also with Gandhi's style of living. He also lived
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Okay, I think we've overshot our time, and thank you so much, Professor Soltes. It was a pleasure having you. It was a wonderful lecture, very nice and very informative and very comprehensive. We value your experience and the way you shared it with us so animatedly. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next year too.
All right, one hopes. Yes, maybe next time in person. You never know.
Oh yeah, hopefully yes. That would be great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.